I was ready to love the whole world, but no one understood me. And so I learned to hate. In 19th century Russia, there emerged a phenomenon people began to call superfluous men. These were young, generally well-educated, but aimless individuals who saw no particular point to living, but continued to do so anyway. They often appear in literature as semi-Byronic protagonists or memorable side characters. This arguably began with the womanizing titular character in Pushkin's Evgeny Onegin, and found its apotheosis in Turgenev's aptly titled Diary of a Superfluous Man. And as I look around the media sphere today, we often seem to be having a similar conversation. There are seemingly endless think pieces on the phenomenon of purposeless young men in our own time, and the particular consequences this may bring. So today, I thought we would take a look at my favourite depiction of just such a young man. Someone who is emblematic of all the temptations of a hedonistic, egoistic, nihilistic lifestyle, but who exemplifies all of its pitfalls too. This is Lermontov's legendary novel, A Hero of Our Time, and we will be picking apart the philosophy of its inimitable protagonist, Pechorin. Get ready to learn how we can be led astray by false promises, why vulnerability is much more complicated than it first appears, and what an old Russian novel can teach young men like me. As always, bear in mind that I won't be able to cover every aspect of Lermontov's novel here, and I'll more be looking at it from the standpoint of an individual psychological profile, rather than a sociological comment on the state of Russia at the time, even though the latter was just as relevant to Lermontov's aims. So let's begin by looking at the seductive nature of Pechorin's approach. What makes his life so darkly appealing? 1. The Temptations of Carelessness. In the Gospel accounts of Jesus' life, he is tempted 3 times by the devil in the desert. And each time, Lucifer comes back with a slightly different idea. The first time, he tries to tempt him with food. The second time, by attacking his faith. But the third time, he promises unending earthly power and glory, a sort of egoistic fantasy that is meant to appeal to any scraps of pride Jesus might have. Of course, in the Gospels this does not work, and Jesus remains uncorrupted. But even for non-believers like myself, this is still a dramatic reminder of the types of temptation we can face in our own lives, and the seductive power of a certain self-promoting view on reality. From the outside, Pechorin's life seems to embody just the benefits of this kind of egoistic, tempting approach. For the first half of Lermontov's book, we see him primarily through the eyes of other people, principally a staff captain named Maxim Maximych. To hear Maxim tell it, Pechorin is the absolute picture of personal mastery. He is intelligent, cultured, charming, and likable. However, what really strikes both him and the reader is Pechorin's enviable, laissez-faire approach to almost everything in his life. How many of us, when we have been caught up in the anxieties or troubles of our own lives, have said, "God, I just wish I could care less about this"? And it is true that much of the philosophy aimed at making life more bearable often talks specifically about managing your cares. Many Stoic philosophers, like Epictetus, advise that happiness was found in only worrying about the things in our direct control and letting go of the rest. That is, we should keep our mind and our eyes firmly fixed on our own actions and our own thoughts, and accept the consequences are simply out of our hands. This is how he found freedom and control in the direst of circumstances. Likewise, much of Schopenhauer's recommendations for minimizing the sufferings of the world are to do with controlling our wills so that we do not desire things to be a certain way. This does look a lot like caring less about what happens in the world. Hell, much of the appeal of an outright nihilistic philosophical outlook is that you do not need to care about anything, and can slowly become de-invested in reality itself, immunizing you from any hurt. You simply don't give a damn. And then there is the matter of freedom. Can you think how much freer you would be if you truly did not care about anything? If the condemnation of other people just meant nothing to you and you had no moral sensibilities? Just think of all of the things you could do. You could say exactly what you want, do exactly what you want, and pursue your own ends without having to fear the consequences. On the surface, there is something undeniably alluring about being this selfish. Pechorin embodies this approach perfectly, and Lermontov does an excellent job at presenting its appeal. Pechorin does not care who he upsets and who he annoys, and this means he simply takes what he wants from life. He deceives women into falling in love with him and kills someone basically just for irritating him. Seen in the cold light of day, this all sounds pretty grim, but Lermontov puts a spin on it that would easily appeal to someone feeling powerless or lacking a sense of purpose in their lives. Essentially, Pechorin is both an egoist and a hedonist, and this allows him to do things that most people's moral compasses would prevent them from enacting. Beyond all this, he is so skilled that he still appears incredibly charming to most people around him. He is extremely capable, extremely competent, and totally unapologetic. In these initial chapters, he embodies a particular fantasy someone might have about life. It is the allure of considering oneself beyond good and evil. Pechorin is a little bit like how Nietzsche described the lion stage of the Übermensch in Thus Spake Zarathustra. This is someone who now considers themselves above the petty concerns of other men. Likewise, this endorsement of an egoistic approach to life would later find a voice in the philosophy of Max Stirner, who at points definitely gives the impression of recommending simply doing what you want, free from the constraints of mysterious forces like God or morality. Though of course I'm simplifying his thoughts here. Pechorin's anti-heroic approach can seem immediately appealing to anyone who feels excessively boxed in by the moral or societal rules around them, or lacks a sense that any of this matters. It's a little bit similar to how some people idolize Patrick Bateman from American Psycho or Tyler Durden from Fight Club. Whatever the intentions of the author, these characters have a surface-level appeal because they are a power fantasy. It's the tempting wish to care not just about fewer things, but actually nothing apart from your own skin. Viewed from the outside, where we are burdened down with worries, anxieties, and a guilty conscience, the prospect of the extremely powerful individual who simply does whatever takes their fancy and says to hell with the notion of right and wrong can appear as a kind of charmed life. And again, Lermontov plays into this idea throughout the novel. Anyone observing Pechorin would think that he had everything your classic young man would desire. He accrues social status by his manipulative machinations. He has women falling at his feet as he has perfected the art of tugging on their heartstrings. And he holds himself as pridefully above the rest of the world. In his mind, he is the supreme individual, an exceptional man who not only enacts his will skillfully, but believes he has the right to. At multiple points in the novel, he gets people killed or makes them suffer, but this doesn't seem to trouble him one bit. If we feel directionless and purposeless, it is easy to turn to the only thing that seems intrinsically desirable, our own pleasure. This will not necessarily happen, but it often appears to. However, the main obstacle standing in the way of this is often that we care about following our conscience and not attracting the ire of other people. We may even think that we would get what we desired if we just allowed ourselves to be evil and let go of all of this conscientious nonsense. At the beginning of the novel, Pechorin fulfills this wish down to a T. And since this is a video specifically aimed at young men, we might also note that Pechorin's achievements are those traditionally associated with masculinity. He wants the admiration of women, he wants to show himself to be better and superior to other men, and he wants to be admired as a figure of high social status and influence. And what's more, he does achieve this. Even the staff captain admits that it bothers him that no woman has ever loved him as much as Pechorin. And yet, despite all of these successes, Pechorin will also inevitably raise the question, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? Because, like most who would say they care for and about nothing, Pechorin is hiding a heap of his own miseries buried deep inside, each of which is only exacerbated by this uncaring approach. And we'll start with one of the classic human troubles and one of my favourite philosophical topics, loneliness. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons. You'll be supporting the channel and gain access to exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. A yearning for connection. Although he is best known for his Christian apologetics and the Chronicles of Narnia books, C.S. Lewis also had some very interesting thoughts about friendship. He considered close platonic friendship to be at least as important as romantic love, and thought that anyone without close, vulnerable bonds with others was living a sort of half-life. This is a thought that often crops up in philosophical history. Aristotle used to talk about the importance of virtuous friendships for achieving eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Plato considered friendship to be the highest form of human relation. And, in more modern times, Kierkegaard thought that love was not only something reserved for our romantic partners, but should be infused within our platonic bonds and our entire approach to life. This is the first thing we find missing from Pechorin's existence: the experience of true friendship. At first glance, you might wonder what on earth I'm talking about. After all, we just said that Pechorin was well liked, both by men and by the women he pursued. But if we take Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas' definition of friendship as wishing the good of the other for their own sake, then we can see what is holding Pechorin back from experiencing the deeper joys of friendship. Because Pechorin sees other people the same way we might see a hammer or a spanner, a tool to use for his own ends. Pechorin is not unaware that his approach is egoistic. He expresses as much at multiple points in the novel. But perhaps it is most evident in the way he talks. When he describes people, it is almost always in relation to how useful they will be to him. This has become so habitual that it almost slips into the background. Even the person he asks to serve as his second in a duel, something often held by someone in whom you have absolute trust, is merely an acquaintance who means very little to him. Part of Pechorin's feeling of being superfluous is precisely because he views people on the whole as being superfluous. And he cannot help but turn this attitude back on himself. Perhaps the most extreme example of this uncaring attitude he has towards others is in his dealings with a young soldier, Grushnitsky. Grushnitsky considers Pechorin a friend, and when they are out one night, they encounter the Princess Mary, who immediately takes a shine to Grushnitsky, riling Pechorin's envy. For mostly this reason, Pechorin then sets out to steal the affections of the princess and ruin Grushnitsky's hopes of being with her. Pechorin carefully manipulates Mary to notice him treating her with slight derision, before slowly getting her addicted to his affections. Soon Mary can think of no one but Pechorin, and Grushnitsky is merely a memory to her. At this betrayal by a friend, Grushnitsky becomes angry and eventually challenges Pechorin to a duel, where Pechorin kills him. And all of this stemmed from just a moment of envy from Pechorin. We are explicitly told how highly Grushnitsky spoke of Pechorin before this event. He praised him extensively and called him his friend, and yet Pechorin had no problem killing Grushnitsky. Here, Lermontov displays a much less pleasant side of uncaring egoism. Sure, it may seem nice to be liberated from the constraints of public morality, but what would someone who truly achieved this do? They would likely not be a noble rogue, but an uncaring sociopath. This is all worth noting, partly because much of Pechorin's inner torment is caused by his loneliness. He said he only ever met one person who he felt even came close to understanding him, and that was one of his old loves, Vera. But rather than pursue being with her, he simply used her, broke her, and discarded her. But when he thinks he'll never see her again, he is totally distraught. In his habit of uncaring egoism, he actually drove away one of the only people that might have made him happy. Part of the appeal of Pechorin's amoral carelessness is the extent to which it protects him. We get the sense that he simply cannot be hurt in the same way other people can. When Grushnitsky no longer admires and likes him, Pechorin remains unaffected, since he never really valued Grushnitsky in the first place. However, as psychoanalysts and psychologists like Carl Rogers have pointed out, what insulates us from hurt will also insulate us from connecting with others. Or, to again draw from Nietzsche, completely running from pain will also prevent us from ever experiencing the more intense joys in life. These observations are not some trite idea that there is no pleasure without pain, but rather that certain components of a fulfilling life involve someone taking a huge amount of emotional risk. Alain de Botton expresses this thought eloquently when he says we often have a desire to be loved and cared for, but also a real fear of the vulnerability that allowing someone to know us and allowing us to truly care for them would involve. And yet, one cannot be achieved without the other. As Pechorin himself puts it, "My love never brought anyone happiness because I never sacrificed anything for those I loved. I loved for myself, for my personal pleasure." And this is the first example of something we will see many times throughout Lermontov's novel. Pechorin is not being entirely honest with himself when he says he does not care. There is a contradiction between his egoistic hedonism and the inner emotional reaction he has to it. He paints himself as above those around him, but this has the inevitable consequence of making him feel friendless and alone. There is a real question of to what extent his carelessness is self-deception. He might feel a little less lonely if he only gave in to this persistent urge to connect with other people. After all, he was not always like this. He says that he specifically trained himself to keep all people, and especially romantic prospects, at a distance from him, so that he does not allow them any power to affect him. Little does he know that in avoiding the possibility of any sharp wounds, he is condemning himself to a dull, existential ache. I cannot help but call to mind some of the messages that are fed to young men today. I often see the advice to never be vulnerable or get close to anyone for roughly the same reason Pechorin gives. It is true that allowing yourself to care for other people opens you up to huge emotional risk, and if minimizing short-term pain is your aim, then distance is a solid strategy. However, Lermontov displays the other side of the equation. When we say we do not need anyone or we do not care how others feel, how honest are we being? Are we truly yearning for connection, yet still working to cut ourselves off from its very possibility? The answer is going to be individual, but I think that this is part of the specific value of the text. Lermontov does not tell you directly how to live. It is, to quote his own reflections on the work, a fable without a moral. He is just presenting the inevitable consequences of this individualistic, egoistic approach to life. It is not a prescription, but simply informs your choice through the portrait of someone who has already made it, and questions what draws people to this way of life. However, this is only the start of Pechorin's peculiarities. Next, we'll look at how Lermontov examines one of the most alluring components of Pechorin's life, and how we can begin to worship it to our own detriment. 3. Pride and the price of power. By now, you may have spotted a trend in Pechorin's general approach. He glorifies the idea of personal power. This sometimes just bubbles away in the background, but it becomes very prominent in his self-reflective moments, where he says, "If I considered myself to be better, more powerful than everyone in the world, I would be happy." This focus on power characterizes his entire approach to life. His main goal in almost all interactions is to be of significance to the person he is affecting. That is, he wants to be a major player in their lives, to influence them, either for better or for worse, but normally for worse. He describes his greatest pleasures as exerting his will over other people. He cares less what he actually does, but at all times prizes being the most powerful person in the room. To again quote Pechorin, "Can it be that my single purpose on this earth is to destroy the hopes of others?" It is the fact that he succeeds in this power lust that creates part of the fantasy we talked about earlier. He always has more power over others than they have over him and is not shy about exercising it. And there is some philosophical precedent to this being so tempting. Famously, Nietzsche thought that one of the great sources of human fulfillment was in some way exercising your power. This might be over the world, or over others, or over oneself. But the idea of flexing your muscles and displaying your own strength was a deep psychological need that Nietzsche thought humans had. At some level, this makes sense. The inverse of feeling powerful is feeling helpless, and this is almost universally seen as a horrible state to be in. So much so that many psychoanalysts, including Freud himself, analogize this to castration. The idea of power and psychological and psychosexual worries seem to fit together like hand in glove. So a certain amount of power seems pretty healthy to live a fulfilling life. But Pechorin lets power become his obsession. And in writing this, Lermontov makes an excellent observation about the interplay between a preoccupation with power and deep existential insecurity. Funnily enough, despite his own praise for power, this critique is also found in Nietzsche. The highest form of power in Nietzsche's eyes is not enforcing one's will on other people, but rather enforcing it on yourself through a kind of self-mastery or self-overcoming. He would say that Pechorin's constant need to assert himself on others is itself a form of weakness. He feels powerless inside, as evidenced by his sense that life is meaningless, and so his reaction is to try and influence the world as a constant source of reassurance that he does in fact have some personal power. It's a bit like a leader who needs to constantly remind everyone that they're in charge. Or, to quote Game of Thrones, any man who has to say, "I am the king," is no true king. Nietzsche would probably argue that Pechorin is displacing the discomfort from his own inability to find meaning in his life or face the highs and lows of existence by externalizing that and striking out against others and the world. This same sort of observation is made by Jacques Lacan when he suggests that a need to be externally powerful, like a lot of needs, sometimes stems from a deep feeling of internal powerlessness and a desire to be complete. The same goes for Pechorin's pride and vanity. He sees this as the crown of his power, a well-earned reward for what he is capable of. Yet some would argue that this too is only betraying his inner lack. In many of the Buddha's writings, he views emotions like pride and excessively large egos not as signs of strength, but primitive defense mechanisms against the torments of the world. When he sees kings accumulating masses of wealth or people wishing to inflict harm on others, he often paints this as stemming from their inability to endure the ever-changing nature of the universe. They are unable to deal with the fact that any individual human is completely powerless against the ravages of time and chance and death. And so they make a vain attempt to deny all of this by accruing power, pretending that this will insulate them from the hardships of life. Or, as Ernest Becker would say, they are in denial of their own death. Pechorin does the same thing with all of these strategies he uses to detach from the world. The Buddha might argue that all of this reveals a far deeper attachment that Pechorin has, to a permanent, unchanging state he can reside in. The kind of enacted ego worship Pechorin engages in is arguably a further sign of the thin, fragile nature of his power. In one diary entry, he confesses that he is not sure what any of his life has even been for. He has this desire for a calling to serve. That is, despite all of his hard-won individual power, Pechorin still ultimately wishes to submit to something. If we agree with Nietzsche or even Sartre, this might be a personally crafted set of authentic values. Some religious thinkers would argue that Pechorin is just feeling a God-shaped hole. But either way, he feels this need for something that is greater than just himself and his ever-changing wishes. He wants his existence to have a direction and have progress. Perhaps the endless and pointless quest to always be influencing and interfering with other people would simply vanish if he were to find something to sublimate all of this too. This is the downside to his short-term hedonism. His life is no longer lived in broad narrative arcs, but instead becomes a set of little vignettes. Snapshots of a man led by whatever whims strike him in that moment. Interestingly, this philosophical approach also mirrors the structure of the novel. Pechorin amuses himself with his little manipulative games, but they do not make him any more fulfilled because they're not in service to something that matters to him. He has nothing to sacrifice for, and if you believe Ernest Becker or even someone like Bernard Williams, this is a key component to adding a sense of fullness to his life. The idea that he is acting for something, even if it is something he has created, to have a thing he values more than his petty games of power and status. Is it any wonder that his life strikes him as superfluous? I bring all this up because another message I see put to us as young men today is to prioritize our own personal power above all else. This is not a sophisticated idea of power, such as that proposed by Nietzsche, but is instead best summed up as creating as much influence for yourself as humanly possible, whether this is achieved through money or status or anything else. But the character of Pechorin proposes that the simple pursuit of power will often leave us unsatisfied if it is not for something greater than just ourselves. This is one reason Leo Tolstoy's existential crisis will always strike me as particularly insightful. At that point, he had published his great masterpieces, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and yet he still eventually fell into a deep despair because he was doing this only for personal glory and social standing. He describes it as all seeming hollow as soon as he stopped to look at it, like spending years climbing to the top of a tree, only to discover that the view is horribly ugly. Being helpless is rarely pleasant, but there are dangers in making power itself an idol as well. Lermontov again presents this all totally non-judgmentally, but simply wants us to consider the consequences of such an approach. And if you are currently idolizing personal power for its own sake, I hope this gives you a little pause for thought. However, if I'm honest, I don't think any of this gets to the heart of Pechorin's approach. And so lastly, I want to talk about something that hit me very hard when reading this novel, and made me stop and take stock of my own approach to life. 4. The fear of living. Pechorin claims at multiple points in the work that he does not fear death, and to a certain extent, I really do believe him. He stares down a loaded pistol without losing his nerve. He takes extreme physical risks, and is often the picture of courage. However, behind all of this, I think he has a far deeper fear, and one that I find disturbingly relatable. A terror of life itself, and specifically of plunging its depths. The clearest way I could describe Pechorin's approach to life is that he tries his best to simply skim its surface. Every connection he has with another person or engagement with an activity is both incredibly simple and also at a distance. But the strategies he uses to achieve this are fascinating, and we may spot them in our own lives. Firstly, Pechorin avoids being serious to an almost comic extent. In his interactions with others, and even often in his diary, he spends a lot of time hiding behind an ironic way of speaking and thinking. The closest thing he does have to a friend is a doctor named Werner, and they are both very clear that their conversations do not contain much honesty or sincerity, but are instead more like a fun verbal sparring match. They are only out to amuse themselves, and this is the only level on which they communicate. In effect, Pechorin only ever converses in this one way. Even when it seems like he's not, such as when he appears to be bearing his heart for Princess Mary, this is normally a deception in service to a broader game. And even when he privately reflects that he has more complex feelings, he tries to crush them as soon as he can. He is truly only comfortable when he is in this semi-ironic mode. As with much of this section, this ties back to what we said in part 2 about his fear of vulnerability. To be sincere is to take a risk. It is much easier to look foolish when you're being sincere. And this would threaten Pechorin's sense of superiority, which he simply cannot have. But this also deprives him of all of the intricate joys of conversations. It means he never talks deep into the night about ideas that really matter to him, or honestly comfort someone in their more emotional moments. His engagement with conversation is incredibly shallow, and this limits the experiences he can have. I'm talking about this seemingly minor point to do with conversation, because the same can be said of pretty much all the rest of Pechorin's life. There is nothing wrong with not taking life seriously, but Pechorin doesn't even want to take it sincerely. This is evident in his inability to show commitment to anything he sees. He does not commit to lovers or friends or even an idea of a set of values. Even his egoism is not so much his considered approach to life, but rather what he's left with when he fails to care about anything else. But this inevitably does not make him happy. He himself admits as much. The tragic irony is that by aiming to maximize his own happiness, he has taken an approach which guarantees his long-term misery. At some level, he does seem to recognize this, because he mourns the fact that he doesn't care about anything. But as a defensive measure against self-interrogation, he pretends that this is because it is the intellectually sophisticated thing to do. He dresses up a form of overly simplistic cynicism as a kind of profound wisdom, and pretends that there is no more thinking or considering to be done. But by its very nature, this collapses his entire life into a single variable, whether or not he will be happy in the very short term. Or we might say, whether he is amused. This is part of what can make his life seem like a fantasy. We imagine that if he managed to always prioritize his short-term happiness, then this would eventually translate into a life that is overall fulfilled. But this is just not how things work for Pechorin. Again, it keeps him skating along the surface of life. He spends his time sampling different lives, but never spends enough time or energy with one to make it seem meaningful or interesting. He is Sylvia Plath sitting under a fig tree, watching all his potential lives crumble before him, scrambling to take little bites of each of them before they hit the ground. This is partly why he feels so superfluous. His only commitment is to superfluity. And for Pechorin, this approach seems to stem from a certain kind of fear. It is both a fear of getting hurt and a fear of missing out on what the rest of life has to offer. When he feels affection for someone, this goes away as soon as they reciprocate the feeling. This might seem mysterious until we remember that a mutual relationship requires many things of him. It would mean giving up a portion of his freedom and power to someone else. Sure, there is the potential for much joy on the other side of it, but again, it is putting himself in a vulnerable spot. If he never chooses to be with any particular person, then he can relish all that delicious potential that he would have with any of these women. But at the same time, he ensures that none of this potential would be fulfilled. This allays both his anxiety about being hurt and his FOMO, but it also contributes to this feeling he has that his life has little to no depth. He spends his existence in permanent adolescence, refusing to take on any duties or responsibilities or curtailments on his freedom. Such things would leave him vulnerable, and this thought he simply cannot stand. The thing is, when we talk about young men being discouraged from vulnerability, this is often limited to a discussion about opening up. And it is true that many young men perceive they have no one who cares about how they feel and view the expression of emotions itself as a little embarrassing. To quote the American writer Bell Hooks, we young men often are unable to allow ourselves to love for fear that the loved one will abandon us. And to a certain extent, this generally does chime with my own experience. However, I think this is only scratching the surface of the consequences that arise when we men are disincentivized from ever being vulnerable. Sincerity is a form of vulnerability, as is commitment, as is the mere notion of caring about others or values or ideals, as is the idea of duty or responsibility or being part of something greater than ourselves. When we discourage young men from vulnerability, we are doing far more than stifling their emotional expression. We are attempting to rob them of the depths of life. Pechorin is just the ideal we are left with. Someone powerful, yet with nothing worth being powerful for. Someone competent, yet floundering. Someone crying out for connection, but unable to even be sincere outside the occasional pages of their own diary. Pechorin is what we have when we as young men are taught to be frightened of so much of life and of experience. It is a life of short-term thrills, devoid of fullness, suffering from a hunger that we not only cannot sate, but do not even wish to acknowledge. And that is if we even manage to achieve the topmost rung of this ideal. Henry David Thoreau once famously said that the great mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. But in some ways, Lermontov's novel carries a far more serious warning than this. Given the things we are often told to do and be, the ways in which we are encouraged to stay away from the deep waters of existence, the best we could ever hope for is to become like Pechorin. It's an unenviable trophy to aspire to. However, with this wider notion of vulnerability also comes a broader idea of how to begin exploring those depths. I submit to you that to be vulnerable is not necessarily to wear your heart on your sleeve or break down crying in front of your lover. It might instead just be a small act of sincerity, a bid for connection, the courage to wish the good of other people, or a commitment to a set of values. Pechorin may be a warning in some ways, and we may recognize him in ourselves. But it is also important to interrogate the components of his approach and ask whether we would like to give a different message for the young men of our time. But if you want to look at some similar themes but with a very different emphasis, then click here to watch my analysis of Dostoevsky's phenomenal novel, The Idiot. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.